Hey everyone, here today to talk about my new released book, Super Punx. That's Punx with an X, Punx. And I am joined here today with my good friend. He's a writer for nerdbot.com. He has helped me edit the book. We've known each other for quite a while now. Heath Andrews.
Thank you. Otherwise known online largely as the Critical Android. And now I don't think. I mean, you say we've known each other, but who are you? We haven't even worked together, I believe, have we?
Yes, we have.
Oh, wait. You're Stefan J.D.
Yes, I'm Stefan J.D., and we used to have a channel together on YouTube called Crypt of the Unknown.
Just on hiatus until we get things back together.
Yeah, when we get the band back together.
Hey, if the Eagles can take 20-something years, no, 18 years, we can take a year and a half.
Yeah, there's no reason why we can't bring that back, that really popular channel. But yeah, we both have our own separate channels as Heath. I will be calling him and referring to him as Webb, which is closer to his real name.
Yes.
So if anyone's confused, I'm just going to say Webb a lot, but it's Heath Andrews as a writer. Yeah, we used to have the old channel, and then you had the Critical Android for a couple years now, and then I just started this channel a couple months ago. So I'm new to the experience. You have been going quite some time, but we have known each other even longer.
Yeah, it goes back to a Facebook group called I Watched the Entire Overblood Super Replay, and how we got acquainted with each other through that group. Interestingly enough, the person who connected us together, we no longer associate with them, but we do associate with each other. And it's just kind of a fitting friendship, is that's the part that lasted from that group, was our connection that we made over writing and gaming and music, and just that kind of sense of God, I wish I had known this person for years because I really clicked with them.
Yes, yeah. It was at that time, the group was very full of misfits and punks itself, and has since over time become pretty well behaved and modded severely to where people are almost kind of forced into a sense of being nice to each other anyways. But
different subject for a different time.
Yes. The reason we're talking about my new book is obviously for promotion, but also just to kind of get the word out on what it's about. And since Webb helped me edit it, I figured we could have a conversation.
Yeah, because it was a really powerful read. It's a little over 90,000 words for people who are interested in the form of it. It's, in terms of the page count, it's a larger page count because Stefan decided to go with a larger typeface for ease of reading, especially in a digital age where, there's some people who, when it comes to reading things on a screen, sometimes it's easier with a bigger typeface anyway, and being on a smaller screen. And then also for people who might be more visually impaired, it's a better chance to be able to take it and read it in. So the page count looks more intimidating than it is, but it's still a beefy read that's very much like kind of the all killer, no filler kind of a sense, in that what's chronicled in this book is a good 6 to 8 months of your life from the time that you were wrapping up freshman year of high school to about the winter break of sophomore year, correct?
Yes.
And that's a time period for people where you're really trying to come into your own because the innocence of elementary school is gone. The coming of adolescence that happens in middle school has already started to take hold. And then once you're in high school, it's almost as if society itself and life itself is throwing you to the wolves of hormones and adolescence and your own tendencies, whether they be more self-destructive, outwardly destructive, or insular, depending on who you are. This is a time where you start to come into a sense of who you're going to be for the next several years of your life before adulthood kicks in.
Yeah, that's correct. And for me personally, like, of course, everything in my life had to change around that point to where my parents had finally decided to get a divorce and they were starting to become their own individual self destructive people in their own ways. And then me, myself, I was already, indoctrinated, or I guess you could say even adopted the punk movement. And I had a mohawk and, the whole gig. And I was trying to learn about being more independent as a human being the more I listened to punk rock music.
Now, even though the punk aesthetic kind of carries throughout the story, this is not so much a story about punk rock itself. Like, some people could write more of a musical autobiography, so to say, where they talk about how music influenced them. And actually, I remember reading and editing a project of yours a while ago, where you were telling the story of some of your years through video games.
Yeah.
And that was an interesting way to go about it. And you can see things like that in other books that people have written. I think Chuck Klosterman wrote one called Fargo Rock City, if I'm not mistaken. That kind of talks about music and influences through his years. I'm just going to double check that. I think it's Fargo Rock City. Yeah, Chuck Klosterman. So that's a way of how music can tell a story. But in this case, here we have it's a very funny story at times, with a lot of what you describe. But this is not overall a funny story.
No. I guess the easy way to explain it, the very brief summary of synopsis of the whole book, really is just about ending freshman year, going into summer right before sophomore, and experimenting a lot with drugs, going through puberty, trying to gravitate towards positive things while not realizing how destructive the world was around me, and even myself making it worse in some cases.
Effectively, this is more of what you would consider to be a cautionary tale of what happens when you think you're just going to experiment with the darker elements, even if they don't seem like the darker elements at the time, of a lifestyle, and what can happen when experimenting brings you very deep into a world that is not all what you would expect it to be once you start seeing the underside of it. Which is not to say or criticize punk in general of having a dark underbelly, because pretty much all walks of life have a dark underbelly, whether it's religion. If a person's deeply Christian, there's a dark underside to a lot of Christian beliefs and the way they carry themselves. Or there can be people who are in the straight edge community who have a lot of self-loathing. There's a lot of dark underbellies to things, but this is that cautionary tale of what happened for you with the punk underbelly. And this would have been around what time frame, like 2000 to 2001 or 2001, 2002, around that time?
Yeah, I think it was. Well, I was supposed to graduate from high school 2006. So I want to say 2002, 2000. Yeah.
Okay.
2002.
And I think one of the things that's important to note here, because this really does shape the narrative, is the kind of environment that you were growing up in terms of not just your home, but the area itself. You were growing up in Arizona, specifically around the Phoenix area, correct?
Yes.
And I don't know if a lot of people know this. It became more evident as the 2000s were coming along. But there's some areas of the country, especially suburban areas, where you're not in the outright poor. But a lot of suburban areas have problems with casual drugs leading into hard drugs.
Yes. And I should say that around this point, like a couple years on, Breaking Bad would come out, about how New Mexico and even Arizona, Phoenix, kind of be known as the meth capital of the world, methamphetamines, and, a bunch of other drugs scoring through there. But, like, that was started to become relevant around this point. And where I lived, I didn't even live, like, in a poor neighborhood or anything. I lived in an upper middle class suburbia. like I knew all the neighbors on my street. They knew me. I grew up with some of the kids on my street, and we all went to their houses on Halloween, and they'd have like spook haunted houses in their backyards that we could walk through. I mean, it's very lighthearted, easy coming up area in the 90s because we moved there probably, let's say, 1991. So 10 years later, and then just this huge wave of just kids falling into drugs around my area. And, punk was part of it, yes, but like Webb said, it wasn't the reason.
Right. Punk was, I guess you kind of see this in certain things. Like, for instance, both the Sex Pistols and the Clash were punk. But Sex Pistols kind of more were the stylized punk, whereas the Clash really led a punk lifestyle in the sense of they actually did rally against the government and oppression and were there about the fans and the people. Whereas the Sex Pistols, I don't want to say they were fake punk, but they certainly didn't. They were a corporate band. I mean, they were basically put together to form a punk aesthetic.
Right.
So
for profit.
Exactly. But the Clash weren't for profit at all. I mean, the Clash were, Joe Strummer actively fought with the record company to make sure Sandinista was priced as it wasn't priced for the full price because it was a triple disc album. And they were trying to, or even 4-disc, I think, but they were trying to cut that down to where it wasn't the case, to make it cheaper for the fans. And that's punk. I mean, when people think punk, they don't think about chopping down profit margins. But in a world that is corporate, where you have to mitigate that and live with that, fighting the record company to make sure that your audience could afford an album, that's punk. That truly is punk.
Yeah. Yeah, anything sticking to your guns to help the lesser man, in my eye, could be viewed as punk. Even I explain this a lot in the book. Actually, I go through one little section where it's just titled "Music," I believe, and I do describe my idea of the scene and when I was growing up in that period, what I thought it was, and it's basically a mixture of things. It's not one grandiose idea. It's violence, it's poverty, it's unity, it's a lot of things. Rancid, raunchy, fucking disgusting drug abuse is definitely part of it, but I don't think it's all of it. But I do take time to describe my idea of what I felt punk was growing up in the scene with the aesthetic.
Now, speaking of the aesthetic and whatnot, one of the kind of funnier parts, I guess, of the story itself, if we can hit on a lighthearted moment before we start talking about some of the darker ones. But you mentioned quite a bit how you had a mohawk, you were sporting a mohawk, and the amount of attention that it got you from everyone.
Yes. Freshman year, man, everyone wanted to take photo class because, they thought it was bullshit. I mean, some people thought it was bullshit, it'll be an easy grade, just go take pictures. Which they weren't wrong, although you were heavily criticized by our teacher there. This was at Ironwood High School in Glendale, Arizona, Mr. White, who was a punker. And, people thought it was bullshit, and then some people did it because they were artistic and they had artistic tendencies. And when you saw me walking around with a foot-high mohawk, I mean, you have a camera in your hands, the first thing you're going to want to do is take a picture of it. I understand that. But when there's over 1,000 students at the school, and you can imagine how many of them went to photo class 1, 2, 3, and 4, that was a lot of people coming up to me every day.
Oh, dear.
And, yeah, I would go to parties and people would be like, "Oh, hey, I have my camera in my car. Do you mind if I just real quick, if it's okay?"
You celebrity, you.
Yeah. It made me very popular. But But the funny thing is, I was trying to look tough, but girls thought it was cute.
Well, when I first met you about, gosh, it had to be about maybe 8, 9 years ago now, which goes to show how far back we go.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but when I first started talking to you, I believe you were definitely still smoking cigarettes, and I think you were still drinking pretty heavily at times too, right?
So yeah, it was like once a week, but that once a week would be like a whole bottle of whiskey to myself.
Yeah. I remember that being reflected in some of your stories too. The power and the danger of alcohol that it can have on people, reflected in some of the characters that you had written. But you have since really changed even that up in your lifestyle too.
Yeah, this is correct. Kids, when you get older, things change. I'm only 34 and I'm already balding. I remember watching Ghostbusters growing up thinking Bill Murray's already balding? Geez, that must suck. Yeah. But yeah, I go to the gym. I try to make it 4 times a week, and I promise I won't preach. I never try to, but it's just you kind of have to explain it. But I do go to the gym 4 times a week. I try to eat more healthy now. I have since not smoked cigarettes in over a year, and that is one of the best choices I ever made in my life. Even more so than drinking. Cigarettes are awful. And but yeah, and then I have not drank and gotten drunk in probably the same time. I think I had one day where I went to a friend's and we had like a few beers just hanging out, but nothing like, nothing extreme.
So that change in lifestyle, when you look at how you are now to when you look back on your childhood and your adolescence there, obviously it's going to bring up a lot of feelings. So if you had that opportunity to go back in time to your childhood that you cover in this book, what's maybe this might be a tough question because it's certainly an emotional one, but is there a certain point in time during the course of that book where you would wish you could go back in time to speak to your younger self? What point in time would that be, and what would you tell them?
It's tough because I always question like the ethics of talking, like even time travel in general, but like talking to one's younger self, like would I still become the person I am now, which I really love, you know, would I still become that with the trials and tribulations taken away from me and the overtones of extreme personal danger? I would say that right at the beginning of the book, I would go and say everything's going to be all right. Just mine, just go with the flow, head through the storm, and you'll come out the other side all right. Like that's probably what I would say.
For me, it would be I would go back in time to around. I'm not sure what point in my life it would be back to, but I do know I would go back and tell my younger self, "Hey, you're going to lose your mom in 2016, and there's nothing you're going to be able to do to stop it. So you need to cherish the relationship you had with her." Like, that's what I would probably tell myself. But when I look back at your story, I think one of the saddest parts of it is, and I don't want to go into too much detail for people who want to read the book because it's a very explosive journey, but you didn't have that kind of a relationship with your mom, especially not today.
Right. So the heading, kind of the where we're heading in the book is really, I'm getting lost on my own journey through experimenting and just trying to have fun and be a teenager. And, I was one of those people that like to be, had tendencies to always overdo it. And that's certainly in there. But yeah, it heads towards the fact that my mom also starts to lose herself along with me in her own way, in her own vices. And then she ends up becoming, yes, an addict. And I have not spoken to my mother since, I want to say, 2017, and nothing has changed. So, yeah.
Now, this is a hard question too, but I do want to point this out for people who that might resonate with. When it comes to your family, I mean, I think we're all instilled with this idea that you're supposed to be there to support and love your family. But would you say, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, so that's why I say would you say this, but it's kind of a leading question. Would you say that there comes a point in time where you have to recognize that sometimes your family is toxic and you have to remove them from your life?
Objection, Your Honor, leading the witness.
It is, like I said, it's a leading question, so of course you're able to disagree with it if you choose to.
No.
Okay.
No, Webb, no, you're right. I think the biggest thing that killed it for me was that my mother is one of those people who doesn't have the capacity to understand that she's the one wrong. She takes no responsibility whatsoever. So it's almost like if you point out the honest truth, the first thing she's going to feel is that you're attacking her, and and then immediately it's your fault that anything happened. Regardless if you were holding a video in front of her showing her that she did it, she would still say it's your fault. And after years of that, knowing that it's the complete opposite, you can only give so much before there's nothing left to give.
Yeah. And it's, like I said, it was one of the harder parts to read when all that's happening, when it comes to parents. And I think what we have to realize as we grow up, and this is part of, this actually ties into punk very well when it comes to authority.
Mm-hmm.
Just like with government, which a lot of punk is about, and being anti-government, parents are also authority figures. But I think what some punks don't realize is that there's necessary authority to help govern in the sense of, like, be a guiding force. But then there's other authority which does not deserve to be an authority. And that ties in with not only the government, but there are also some people who are good parents and some people who are just not cut out to be parents, who have the responsibility thrust upon them because of their life. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they should be in that position.
Right. And that's kind of the heartbreaking thing about both of my parents, especially my mom, is that growing up for the first, I want to say 12 years of my life, because this happened end of freshman year, so I'm like 15 going on 16 because my birthday's in the summer in August. And I want to say till 12. Then they really started having super fights. But for the first 12 years of my life, it was literally the Brady Bunch. And that's why it's so heartbreaking for me, because I remember what they were and had to see what they became. And it's just like black and white, yin and yang, oil and water. Like it just doesn't mix. It doesn't resonate. Like I don't even know how it happened, really, is kind of the best way to put it.
Yeah. And I know for my father, because you talk a bit about this, and again, I don't want to give away too much, but I had I think this is actually one of the points that we can discuss, because it is it's something that hints at what's to come about the relationship with your father and how frustrating it was. But my father could be very emotionally abusive in the way that he spoke with me, in terms of he would kind of like have this breakdown in terms of he might start yelling about one thing, like the floor not being dirty, or the floor being dirty. And the next thing you know, he's railing about that you're a lazy, worthless, fat piece of shit and all this other stuff, just like going off on this tirade that doesn't make any kind of sense when you break it down. Like he had some sort of an anger and emotional issue. Something was going on in his brain that was causing this to occur.
Mm-hmm.
But there was a time too when my father, when I moved out, the day that I moved out of living with him, was when there was an argument about me chipping in for the heating bill because he was using these space heaters in the house that I was not using because I don't like the heat. And he wanted me to pay for heat that I wasn't using. And I found that to be unfair because I wasn't using any heat. In the summer, when I use the air conditioner, of course, I'll pay more towards the electric bill. I'm using the air conditioner. But in the winter, if I'm not using the heat, not turning on that heater, why should I have to pay for it? And then he starts saying, accosting me about not having to pay rent. And I said, there's a point that we can agree on. I'm not paying rent. So if you want me to pay rent, call it rent, and we'll come to a fair deal about it. That's perfectly fair. But I'm not going to pay for heat that I'm not using. And his reaction was to punch me in the stomach. Just punched me. And I remember looking at him with this expression, because there was no inclination of me to hit back. I just kind of looked at him with this look of like, what did you just do? Why would you do that? And it severely changed the shape of our relationship.
Yeah.
There's a scene in this book where you talk about your father hitting you. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that, because even though you talk about it with the book, I think that there's a lot more that can be said about how that affects a person and the relationship, as well as your view of authority.
So this is also a very amicable exchange, just like with Webb and his father. My dad didn't actually really hit me too often, and when he would, it'd be on the tush, and it wouldn't really be nothing, you know. I mean, it'd sting, which was what it was supposed to do, but he wasn't really like extremely abusive. Probably because most of the time I just agreed with him, even though as I would grow up later, I would learn that he's not a very intelligent person, very caveman, even a cretin. But the portion in the book where I do talk about this one time where he just really had it out for me. We were doing, and it's hard to recall exactly what I wrote in the book, but it was something, we were watching something on TV. He wanted me to go to bed, and I jokingly said, I'm not tired. I shouldn't have to go to bed if I'm not tired. I'm probably like 10 years old. And he got up off the couch, and he didn't like the way I told him that or something. And so he began to chase after me. And I ran to the bathroom where you'd have to run from the living room, across the kitchen, down the hall, and into the bathroom. So it was a little bit of a chase across the house. The only other place left to go further on towards the bathroom would have been his room, my sister's, or mine. So I was basically at the end of the house. And I had cowered next to the toilet, prepared to be smacked. And my father smacked me. I think the way I describe it is as if he was trying to knock out another man bigger than him with a slap to the face. And when he smacked me, my whole body vibrated to the point where I could feel like my insides jiggling.
Wow.
It hurt so bad that, like, immediately, like, just as soon as he touched me with it, I just remember my face being wet because I just immediately sobbed really hard. Like, he knocked the tears out of me. And then my mom was there because she had tried to stop him. I guess because she was more aware than I was that how bad this was going to go. And I don't know the reason, if there's a preconceived like reason or notion why he was angry in the first place. But I had bruises all over my back, my arm, and like sides of my body from just one smack that like must have spread out the pain through like wherever he hit me exactly, through portions of my body.
Wow.
So that was one moment where I remember my mom saying immediately afterwards, like, you hit him too hard.
As if a child should be even hit at all. And then, yeah, that's, it's terrifying. Especially when a child is, like you said, you were 10 years old, right?
Yes.
That's beyond the age where, like, I don't want to tell people how to parent. I have problems with the idea of slapping kids. I mean, kids are not animals, even if sometimes they act like them sometimes. But even if a person is going to slap a child for bad behavior, to do it at 10 years old is far beyond the norm, in my opinion. At that point in time, it's, a child has cognitive abilities to talk with them and make them reason. Like there was nothing to say that your father couldn't have said, well, the reason why we want you to go to bed is because we want to keep you on a certain schedule, because your body, if it doesn't do things in a certain pattern, it can break that pattern, and the next thing you know, you're staying up later, and next thing you know, it's getting too late to when you try to go to sleep, you're not getting enough sleep for school. So it's better to keep you on a scheduled pattern. That way, your body gets acclimated to it, and you don't break that cycle. That's all he had to have said.
Yeah, I mean, he could have said, "Well, I'm your dad, and you have to listen to me." I would have gone to bed, you know.
Okay, it's that too.
He could have I mean, and again, the thing is like I wasn't never a bad kid growing up. If my parents told me to do something, I went and did it. If I did something wrong, I would own up to it because I hated feeling like carrying around lies or bad habits with me. Like I just hated that feeling that I just lied and I got away with it and now I have to feel the shame of it.
Right.
I always owned up to things I did wrong, and I never tried to do anything that I thought my parents would, look down on me for. And so that's why I think it's worse in my eyes that way, because it's like, man, I just really wasn't a bad kid,
Yeah. And even though during the course of this, though, again, I don't want to spoil the details, but even though you weren't a bad kid, you came across some bad situations while you were during this short time in your life comparatively. We're talking about 6 to 8 months of your life, but you encountered a number of really bad and horrific things, man.
How many bad things or bad situations just pop up out of nowhere, and sometimes even in the open, of just around other people or just people like having zero disregard for the law or just themselves and how they act out. There was a lot of people I met, some of them punks, some of them just delinquents, and I mean, for lack of a better term, losers. And and most of them were older than me. And I should say in this book, it kind of follows four main characters: me, my girlfriend Candy, a kid I knew, a punker Skip, and then another delinquent Tim.
Yes.
Yeah. And there's a smattering of like side characters because and I kind of explained this, but it was like that back in the day where people would show up and then they would disappear and then they would show up again. And, that's just kind of how it is growing up, especially where I lived. And so, yeah, it kind of follows that system. And a lot of those people that show up, or some of the main characters, are delinquents.
Yeah, and I think it's a couple things to note is that when it comes to side characters, not everybody makes it to the end of this story alive.
Yes.
And that's something worth noting for people who are going to be diving into this. Not everybody who's introduced in this book makes it through to the end, but I think it's not a spoiler to say that some of these people who are in deep into things do make it through, and you take time in the epilogue of this to where you had to try to catch up with some of these people to find out if they were still alive, where they were, and what their life is like right now. And there's some pretty startling things for, what some people went through, how some people are still mired in their problems, and other people have come through to find a better life for themselves. But it sounds like almost each and every one of them has a deep regret, or at least they would not recommend, I guess you could say, the lifestyle that they were going through.
Right. When you say startling, even when I heard whether I was speaking through them through text on Facebook or something on the internet or via the phone, when they told me, I was just like, wow, I did not expect to hear that. That brings up the other issue of, how we're all feeling now. And I only did experiment with drugs for about 6 months of my life during this period. Drinking alcohol pretty much ruled my 20s, but drugs themselves, yeah, I didn't continue doing them after this book, but this goes to show just how fast they can take hold of you.
Oh, how fast you spiraled. You spiraled hard in this thing, man.
Yeah. And I know that, like, I feel like shit when I don't go to the gym. And I know part of that is because of my drinking in my 20s, but I also attribute it to the fact that this 6 months, and these people, some of the people in this book, when I talked to them later, they kept going till like damn near almost 4 years ago, some of them, or a couple of years ago. And it's like, I can't imagine how they feel physically or mentally.
It's a lot to think about because there's another scene where, again, this won't be spoilers, but there's a scene where you describe a drug den that you had to go to. And the way you described it sounds like something that you would see in a movie or a television show like The Shield, where somebody's going into a drug den. And the way you describe it, it almost seems to me to be so unreal. It seems like something out of a movie. But then to find out that that's actually how it was, with these people just laying unconscious in various states of maybe not even fully alive. Like, some of them could have even been in like a drug-related coma and not even known it. And just scattered on the floor and barely there, some of them whittling away, their bodies kind of like in not necessarily decayed, if you will, but certainly malnourished. And it just seems like something out of a horror film.
The point of no return. Paranoia does weigh heavily in this book for a lot of the people in there. And, you know, nobody ever trusting anybody, or the people who you can trust, you can only trust a certain amount. You know, it's not too much of a spoiler, but like, you know, a person I knew who I had experimented drugs with, they were actually a drug dealer. And they had no problem. If my mom had wanted to score drugs from them, they would have absolutely no quarrels with doing that. You know, even though we were friends, you know, quote unquote friends, they would, you know, business comes first, man.
Yeah.
So, you know, yeah, all these people, and especially those drug dens, you know, like stuff like that. I mean, people just started losing self-identity, is the way I put it. And once you lose that, you kind of start to create what's left, identity of what's left. And all that's left is you and your drugs. And that's never a good identity to cling to.
No, it really isn't. And that's why... Now, here's one of the things, because you mentioned the DARE program. And I think for some people who might not know what DARE is the school program Drug Abuse Resistance Education. A lot of us had to go through it. And it's full of a lot of exaggerations and some misinformation about stuff. But one thing that they do say in DARE is that they always say that marijuana is a gateway drug. How true or untrue do you feel that statement is based off of what you've seen and what you lived through?
I would say it's not the drug that's the gateway. It's the idea that you can go buy drugs and you can do them without getting caught. And I think marijuana is the most easily, obviously accessible. So when they say gateway, I don't think it's for the abuse or the use. I think it's just for the accessibility. Like you wouldn't be like, the first drug I'm going to go try and score is, you know, LSD or something. I mean, maybe you would, but I highly doubt it.
So it can lead into the lifestyle, basically, is what you're saying.
Yeah. And I think that's what they mean, but they never explain it through that sort of context. If that's not what they mean, then they're wrong.
So even though, this is not a heavy-handed anti-drug, don't do drugs, kids. This is not winners don't lose drugs on the arcade screen. Kind of heavy-handedness of this. This is more just like, look, we had some good, fun times while I was alive during this time period. But shit got real fast. And you probably shouldn't walk down this path that I did, because you easily could not make it through. You could die within this time period that I lived. You easily could have died.
Right. And you're, like you said, Webb, a cautionary tale, because it's easily It's very easy to spiral.
It is, from what you described, really easy to spiral. What I imagine was not easy was trying to write all this down, considering how heavy some of the topics become.
Yeah. So it was really hard to write this, and I had originally tried to write this story when I was 23. So that's where the truth of the nature of the book comes from, because I was very close to that period still. It had just basically happened. And I tried to write about it, but at the time I was just learning how to write, and I didn't really have all the necessary skills in my wheelhouse just yet. So, I had to wait a little while, and I had to get better. And now that I have rewritten that whole entire original manuscript, which was 70,000 words into 90,000, it's a lot more coherent.
I can speak to the coherentness and cohesiveness of it, considering I had to edit the whole thing. So, yeah, yes. I can testify to that. Because I had recommended some edits and whatnot, but when you were going through this and having to determine what to write about, was there anything that had come to mind that happened during that time period that you wanted to talk about, but you couldn't? Because I do know that you had to talk about, in the epilogue, certain things out of people's lives you didn't want to mention out of respect for them, and other people who were in your life. But without going into details, was there anything that you really did want to put in here that you had to cut?
Yes. And I'm okay to talk about this because I have talked to the family. So I had another friend who was actually how to put this? He didn't belong to the main group. He was a friend from another neighborhood who was his own group, and he would have been he was a main character of the original book. But when I talked to his family, they didn't want me to write about him, and they said, it's not because we don't think you respect his memory or anything. It's just that we don't want other people to know kind of his lifestyle and what he was about. Because he was going to go to college, and he was a straight A student. He was going to go to college, but he got killed and shot in front of me. And his parents did not want me to write about that. And I won't say his name, but I had to cut out pretty much, I want to say, at least 10,000 words that were dedicated solely to him. And another thing was just other kids that I met on the street who were also homeless or kicked out of their homes. I could not get in touch with those kids. Some of them I didn't even know their name. And I was not able to get permission to write about them. So those two things, specifically in the case of people that I did know, and then obviously there's a lot of underage sex going on around the time. And as I started writing it in the original manuscript, I was like, no, this isn't right, because we were all little young teenagers, and I don't want to write about this.
You didn't want to do the Stephen King end of it thing?
Right. So I mostly allude to the fact hey, then we went at it or something. I don't get into detail.
Probably a good idea. Probably
yes.
A safe bet on that one.
Yeah.
One thing I do want to point out, because this might, I know this was something that was sitting in my chest when I was reading the book, and I feel like this should be said outward. Maybe this is one thing that is helpful to put. This is kind of be like a final edit. You talk about how you're growing up in your household, and when problems start happening, you also have a younger sister. And I want to be known, if anybody is severely worried when trying to read this, your sister makes it out of this okay.
Thankfully, for a greater portion of when this stuff was going on, she would spend a dedicated amount of time at her friend's house to avoid the situation. And I do make mention of that. She actually also didn't want me to write about her in the story, when she was involved in situations that did go too far. So I did cut those out, and the things that are mentioned in there of her are only good, positive things, which, when I think of my sister, I do think of her as a positive person when she's not being angry at me.
She's also brought two beautiful girls into this world too, hasn't she?
Yeah, and I have two beautiful nieces, and they look just like her, and they're just big dorks just like her.
And that's a positive thing that's obviously come out of all this is that they have their uncle Stefan who survived all this, who is a wonderful person who can be there for them as an uncle, and then you have a wonderful sister, obviously, who's able to bring those girls into the world and being a better parent to them than possibly she had for parents for her, to make sure they get the things that she never got from the parental situation. And then
Yeah.
you've got a story here to tell as you've gone through all of this, to kind of philosophize a bit about how adolescence affects kids and their place in the world, as well as the cautionary tale about what this could have occurred. With the philosophy element of things, you talk about it an awful lot, and you talk about men growing up, or boys growing up to be men. What do you think when it comes to that maturation of adolescence? What do you think are the misconceptions that we have about what a boy has to do to be a man? Because I think there's societal pressures about that versus a reality.
I mean, obviously, a big one is you don't have to lose your virginity ASAP. There's no time clock. That doesn't make you a man. What would is finding somebody you love to actually lose said virginity to. I know that a lot of men put weight on that and carry it around with them. I actually even know a guy who's 27 who still hasn't lost his virginity. And I keep telling him, he gets depressed about it. He's like, I'm not a man. It's like, that does not make you, it has nothing to do with it. That's one of the big things. I think the pressure of growing up too fast and having to take on responsibility. No, take your time growing up. Don't try to rush into being an adult because it's no fun with the gimmicks of bills and everything and so on and so forth. I mean, what would you add to that, Webb?
Oh boy, I think what I would say is the biggest misconception is this idea of having to prove how tough you are. There's points in the book, and this is kind of the part that's so tough about adolescence, is that when you're young and going through that time period, because other men and boys are so, I guess, not raised or socialized in the right way, that sometimes they respect toughness more than they should as the measure of things. So it creates this kind of cyclical effect to where when people are raised that way, you feel you have to act that way to get respect, which causes you to act and appreciate toughness, so to say, which cycles back around. And somewhere along the line, that has to break. Like, that cycle has to break. And you have to realize that to be a man is not about being tough. It's about knowing how to make the right decision at the right time. That is the definition of being a man. And even if we take away gender roles and all that stuff about how we function in society today, that holds true no matter how you define yourself. Being able to make the right decisions at the right time is a huge thing. And sometimes that means having to be tough, so to say, and have to put on a front to make sure that you can be the font of strength in a situation. But other times it means knowing not to be in that situation and to get the hell out of it. And knowing that this is not the right place or the right time to do this. So I think that's a huge thing about masculinity and how we define it, is that if we want to be these tough masculine figures, it's all about having the wisdom and the strength of mind to know how to deal with a certain situation the right way to make everybody get out of it okay.
Right. Yeah. There's a lot of kids in this book that you could attribute that to. They just, the way what they would call it is, quote unquote, coming up, or I came up, right?
Yeah.
And it's like when you do certain things, you're held responsible for them, whether it's being a drug dealer, dropping out of school, not treating women right, not listening to your parents, or whatever it may be. you're going to be held responsible for that. And going against the grain of positive things like that, staying in school and not doing drugs, those things are what make you a man. And not only that, but a good person in general. And these kids in here, a lot of them did try to do that. They would try to think, lead themselves down the wrong path of making the wrong choices simply just to prove, like Webb said, that they were tough, that they were men, that they could handle it, that they could handle you or anything. And in the end, all it did was bring them grief. So, yeah, I do think I agree with Webb. I think that comes across, at least hopefully it does, in the book.
In kind of a smaller way, that's totally not related to the punk culture or whatnot, but I can compare things to, like, how when we mature, we have a different look on things. Like, I remember when, in 1998, is when the Pokemon games first came to America. So I would have been 13 at the time when they first came out, and loved Pokemon. But it was at that borderline age of the age of toughness, where people look at certain things and throw them away as being, that's for kids. I'm a teenager. I'm growing up. I'm past that baby shit. And then, later on, once like college hit, like those same people who teased me for playing the Pokemon games and certain other like non like brutal violent games, first person shooters and everything like that. Same people who provoked me for that. Once I got to college, it's like, dude, you got Pokemon cards? Fucking bring that shit out. Let's play. It changes so much once you get past that idea of machismo. When you get past the idea of like having to be a tough guy, tough man. Once you get past that, the world opens up to you in terms of liking just shit for what it is. You don't have to put on that front anymore. You don't have to act like that stuff is beneath you. You can just have fun with it. And it seems like so much of that kind of lifestyle, when people are acting tough like that, it doesn't seem very fun. It seems more like you're forcing yourself to be a certain way. And when you're forcing yourself to do something, that just takes time, energy, and effort away from doing other things that could be fun.
Yeah, and I believe a lot of these kids lost time on their childhood because of that. I know, even for people who don't know, I have been working on art, trying to get into the comic book industry, trying to get better at drawing. I've been writing, obviously, for a while, but trying to get better at drawing for the past 3 years. And it's subtle, but in the book, I do mention a scene where my punk rock girlfriend sees me reading comic books, and I'm instantly embarrassed by it. And I'm like, oh no, these are my cousins or whatever.
Yes.
And then I didn't read comic books again for another 4 to 5 years after that.
Which, again, goes to show like where we're at in the stage of life now, where people our age, adults, revere comic books.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we can't get enough of them. We see how the younger generation has adapted to them, too. Where now the only people who aren't reading comic books are people who are, well, no, hell, beyond that. Even people in their 50s and 60s read comics because they grew up with them. Yeah. Comics have become more universally appreciated now than they ever were before. Largely thanks to the fact that I think we're becoming a bit more sensitive as a people, even though there's certain people who will decry against that, saying they were too sensitive. But once we started opening up an element of sensitivity and understanding towards others, we're getting more of that appreciation of other elements of popular culture that I think has just made us more connected in terms of our shared interests than we ever were before as people growing up.
And you definitely want to always be evolving and changing constantly. A lot of these kids would say, like, I don't want to listen to my mom, or I don't want to change for my girl. I like who I am. And it's like, well, I hate to break it to you, but if you're not always evolving, if you're not always learning, trying to become a different, better person, better you, the day you die, then you're just holding yourself back. And that negative attitude is going to reflect everything, the basis for everything on your life. And I think I try to explain that and contextualize it again in the book. And, again, like what said, it's don't throw away the things you love
Yeah.
just out of sheer embarrassment. You love them for a reason. Keep them around.
And when it comes to the punk movement, you mentioned too that sometimes punk is a young man's game or a young person's game, because once you get older, you do realize that the conformity of life is a necessary evil. You have to kind of conform in order to be able to get ahead and live a life that's successful. But that energy that's supposed to help change things can still be found in the naivety of youth. And we can still draw inspiration and encouragement from that to remind us that our ideals, that maybe we had to sacrifice a bit of them to conform, but the idealism still has to be there in some way, shape, or form. And we have to look to and respect the youth for keeping that torch alive. And then maybe with the way that we've grown, and if we look back on how we were and how they are, realize that that idealism can be channeled in a way that could make the world a better place if we don't ignore the youth and ignore the punks and cast them aside as outcasts and degenerates. But if we actually listen, we can help refine what they have to say into a way that maybe could get things done.
I agree. And it's 100% how I view kids growing up today, right or wrong. And, I even at work, it's so weird to be the older person at your job sometimes, and you look at these kids and they still wear that badge of naivete, and you try to help them along, but it's at the same time you remember what that badge meant, and it meant strength in ways that you can no longer live your life in because of that conformity. But yes, it does help you sterile your heart once again and kind of keep the compass pointed in the direction positiveness, and I know even back then when I was a teenager, I would try to I'd buy CDs that were from the ARA, which I don't know if it's still around, but it was the anti-racist action. I would do all kinds of things, and I know in the end, whatever it was I was doing that was going towards something to help people in some way, I know it did, and there's nothing wrong with that. Like when like when you give a bum change and you think, I'm just going to go buy booze with it. It doesn't matter what he buys with it. It's the act of you giving to somebody less fortunate. That's what matters.
Yeah,
But people just can't look past the fact that he smells of alcohol and he's an alcoholic probably. It doesn't matter. That's not what matters. So yeah, I think being naive is actually can be strengthening at some points, and certainly in the punk music and punk movement, it has shown that through the years, that people do come together. And not only do they celebrate the music, but they celebrate like other things like Black Lives Matter or whatever it is, movements that are supposed to be for the betterment of the world. And yeah, I think punk definitely attributes to that.
I agree. And even if people can't appreciate some of the stylistic elements of it, whether it be music, fashion, whatnot, the heart of the punk movement comes down to the importance of the individual versus the establishment. And it's not something that we can forget. It's the more hardcore version of that old parable about tossing the starfish into the sea and realizing you can't help all of them, but that to that one that you tossed in, it mattered to that one. And punk's focus on individualism and the rights of the individual is something that is extremely powerful. And at least in this book, we get to see elements of how individuals are neglected by society, either by the higher-ups in society or by other elements of it as well. And what happens when drugs get involved into it that helps deteriorate a situation further, especially in a region that is kind of economically a dead zone to begin with. Even with suburbia, it's not the poorest neighborhood, but when you have this kind of stale culture that isn't evolving, like you said, it's not evolving, it's not moving, when drugs are introduced to it and addictive qualities at that, then things can fall down in a hurry. And that's the cautionary tale of what happens in this book in Super Punx.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's definitely an element too about parenting and how important that is. Like I don't get preachy on it. That's certainly not me. I'm not a parent, but just in my upbringing, it's in there. And I hope that my real hope is that people will find not only is this a sufficient novel that they spent their time and money on, but that they learned something about not only punk but like kids growing up in difficult situations, especially when they might put themselves in them and not realize how badly they are. So I just hope that again it's a cautionary tale. You have to decide for yourself, and I hope people give it a chance.
Well, at the time of this recording, the book hasn't come out just yet, so we're recording this in advance to prep it. So when it does finally come out, we'll each respectively edit the podcast, because this will go up on both of our channels for maximum exposure. And so we'll leave a spot here at the end to tell you where you can get the book and help push it to you guys on the audience there. But not push it like drugs, because we don't want to do that.
No. But we do hope you get addicted.
Yes. We're addicted to this book, because it was a fascinating read, and I was glad to be able to view it and partake in it, even if it was terrifying to know that somebody I love and appreciate so much as you had to go through these terrible times. But I'm glad that you got through it all, and that we're here now to discuss it and bring it to others.
I am honestly still just surprised that I'm still here. Just so surprised that I'm having conversations, still breathing, still kicking, still alive. And, I'm glad with my time that I am here. I am spreading the word about my experiences that hopefully help other people. And like I said, give the book a chance. If this didn't convince you, then I'm sorry. Because I know we certainly touched on heavy topics. The book does cover all the things we talked about. And, I'm glad that I'm done fucking reading it and writing it, because I don't ever want to again. But that's from personal experience.
Oh dear. Well, Stefan, thank you for having me on here so that we could discuss it, and by vice versa, thank you for appearing with me to discuss it on my channel.
Yes, and thanks for actually coming up with this idea, because I had thought like, oh, I'll just make like a 5-minute video or something, and was like, no, let's talk about it. And I'm like, yeah, that's probably, yeah.
It's probably a better idea to get some insight into this, and I do hope that when it releases that you'll all enjoy it. Again, it is Super Punx by Stefan J.D. Punx with an X at the end of it, correct?
Yes, Punx.
All right. And you'll be more than likely self-publishing, correct?
Yes, it's going to be a word-of-mouth book, so please spread the word after you get a copy. If you enjoyed it, you know what to do. It's very punkish in that way, I would say, in that regard.
All right. And thank you all for listening. If you have any questions or comments about it, then obviously you can leave it on the YouTube channel comments here. Or, Stefan, how can they get a hold of you personally?
Yes, so I am on Instagram, where you will find most of my art or little things I do in my life that I think are funny. It is Cyberpunk Holiday. And Webb, where can they find you?
You can mostly find me here on YouTube, leaving things in the comments. I'm also found on Twitter at Critical Android, or I can be emailed at thecriticalandroid@gmail.com.
Yes, and you are also writing for nerdbot.com?
Yes, on Nerdbot, I go under the name Heath Andrews. I've also got the Nerdbot podcast that I host with my co-host Brianna Ceballos, who's our managing editor. And she and I tackle elements of the last week or a half or so before we get the while we're talking about the podcast, go in depth. And we also talk about some of the pieces that we'd written and things that slipped through the cracks that we didn't get the chance to write about. And then on Nerdbot itself, you can check out a lot of the articles that I do about odd news and working on some list-based articles, too, about some fascinating things like top 10 artists who never hit number 1 on the charts.
I gotta listen to that, and I will say, like, they just barely started. I think like 2 or 3 episodes in, and already I find his new co-host fascinating. I think she's funny. She's definitely got some wit to her, and it's a pretty entertaining show. So yeah, I mean, tune in.
She does make me laugh with some of like the acerbic comments that she fires away in there, which can catch me off guard. And it's like, no, Brianna, no, that's not right.
Yeah, it's a highly entertaining show. So yeah, please check it out. Again, Webb is at Critical Android on YouTube, criticalandroid@gmail.com. He writes under Heath Andrews on nerdbot.com. And I am on Instagram, the only place you can contact me aside from my YouTube, under Cyberpunk Holiday. Thanks everyone for listening.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you, Stefan, for having me here.
No problem. Take it easy, everyone.
Bye for now.